Hello. Welcome to the A21 Origin of Cells HL only review. So A21 is an HL only section. So if you're SL and you're watching this video, go away. You don't need to know this. And we don't like learning extra things. That's bad. That's how we confuse ourselves. So A21 is all about where did cells come from? So we learned cells are the smallest unit of life. Well, then the question becomes, where did cells come from? And so, let's talk about it. Standard one. What about early Earth allowed for the formation of cells? Well, two main things. One, no free oxygen. So, was there oxygen on the planet? Yes, but it wasn't our diatomic free oxygen like we're used to now. This free oxygen didn't exist. Therefore, there was no ozone layer. No ozone layer, which means no protection from UV rays. Means more energy hitting the surface of the Earth. Then what we have happening, that's one thing. The other thing is lots of methane and CO2. Why does this matter? Well, the lots of methane and CO2 is going to be greenhouse gases, so the increase in these will cause an increase in temperature. So there's more energy and higher temperatures, but if there's more energy, there's going to be even higher temperatures, and then the greenhouse gases are going to travel even more. So there was way more energy on Earth than there was back then. And so a lot of chemical reactions can happen if there's enough energy. And so what this would have led to is the possible formation of carbon compounds spontaneously. And so instead of them, this led to spontaneous generation of carbon compounds. And these would be known as prebiotic because they were before living things. Prebiotic. And so what happened was we saw some very primitive, like carbohydrates and lipids, start to form spontaneously because of that extra energy. And so these eventually would have led to the origin of cells. So standard 2 is a review from another section. I'm not sure why it's its own standard, but they're the smallest. Cells are the smallest unit of self-sustaining life. Unit of self-sustaining life. And remember, viruses do not meet this definition because they don't do all the functions of life. They have no metabolism or reproduction. So there's a lot of challenges explaining the spontaneous origin because there's a lot of things that would have needed to happen. The main things that would have needed to happen are the following. The first one is catalysis. So this is the inorganic to organic molecule. This happens spontaneously. Normally we only think of it happening in cells. Then from there they would need to self-assemble into larger molecules. So all of these things do not happen anymore because there's not enough energy here on the planet, because we have an ozone layer and there's less greenhouse gases. And so what we need to do is test this by adding a lot of energy. Then after self-assembly, they need to be able to self-replicate or make more copies of themselves. And we'll talk more about self-replication later. And lastly, they need compartmentalization, so they need to be trapped in a membrane. This is probably the easiest one to explain, as we'll see in one of the later standards. So 4, how do we know this happened, or why do we think this happened? One of the reasons is the Miller-Urey experiment. So the Miller-Urey experiment was basically they took a bunch of gases, trapped them in a container, and then shocked it with lightning and heat. And they're like, and they heated it up, and they're like, that's a flame. Well, that looks nothing like a flame. There you go. They heated it up, and they had all these gases in here, and they're like, make it. And so they put a bunch of energy in to try and get it out. And they were able to get some carbon compounds. They actually got even more than they thought as we reanalyzed it later after they were dead. And we felt like, oh, look, there's actually even more carbon compounds than they thought. And so going from that to cells, though, is a lot. So that's catalysis. But the next step is self-assembly, and then these 3. So they really only proved the first step, not the other 3. Okay, so that's the Miller-Urey experiment. Now, the self-assembly, right, and the membrane. Well, we know that vesicles will form naturally. So vesicles form naturally because fatty acids just naturally form these spherical bilayers. And so if you get, especially phospholipids, they form vesicles just when you drop them in a polar substance. And so you get this formation happening right away. You get it like that. And so you get this happening because of the properties of the lipids. And so the spontaneous formation allows it to happen, and this then would separate the internal from the external, which allows us to have our first cells. When we talk about self-replication, we're pretty sure RNA was the first genetic material until DNA eventually outcompeted it. The reason we think it was RNA first is because RNA has 2 special properties. It can self-replicate, and it can act as a catalyst. And so it can be replicating itself as well as acting as a protein at the same time. We know this because we have these sequences of RNA called ribozymes that are found in the ribosomes. And so these are RNA that act like enzymes. So it can do catalysis and it can self-replicate, and so that makes it the most likely for the first genetic material. But then DNA would have outcompeted it because DNA is more stable and so less prone to damage, and so over time DNA would have replaced it. 7. Luca, our last universal common ancestor. Last universal common ancestor. What is Luca? Well, Luca is more of like a hypothetical. It's not like a real thing, really. It's some sort of proto-cell that gave rise to all other living cells that are left. Were there other ones around at the same time as Luca? Probably, but for whatever reason, they didn't survive, and Luca did, because he outcompeted them. So natural selection is the answer. So how do we know, though? There's around 300 genes. There's some evidence that there's even more. There's around 300 genes that are in almost every living thing. And when you check the sequences, they're very, very, very similar. And so this DNA evidence provides us evidence of a common ancestor. So we all share these genes and are descendants of Luca. When did Luca come around? Well, there's 2 ways we can estimate it. The first one we've already talked about, right, is our molecular clock. Our molecular clock. Our molecular clock is a way of looking and comparing different DNA sequences to see how long it's been. So you compare sequences and mutation rates to get an estimated time. And our estimated time is roughly 2 to 4 billion years ago. Oops. Billion years ago. And so we can do that to get a pretty good estimate of when it was. The other thing we can do is look for biochemical evidence in the fossil record. And so we're not looking for fossils, right? It's single-celled, it couldn't form fossils. But what we can find is organic chemicals from billions of years ago. The only ways these could have gotten there is if a cell had made them. And so that's the other thing. We found evidence dating back 3.7 billion years ago that there were some early organic chemicals being formed. Where are we finding them? Well, we're finding them near hydrothermal vents. And we take the evidence from above and we use that to figure out where it would have been found. Those genes are used often for like hydrogen sulfide or from sulfur vents. They're for processing sulfur as energy, just like things that live near hydrothermal vents. So a lot of our genes have to do with organisms that would have been around hydrothermal vents. The other thing we can do is we check the fossils near the seafloor, and that's where we find these organic chemicals. We're finding them near hydrothermal vents. Therefore, most likely, that's where the first ancestor of all living things originated. And that is A21, the origin of cells. Thanks for watching.